Okay. Great.
Two sessions on global supply chains. We have until 11:15, so we've got approximately an hour and a quarter. Let me just introduce the panel very briefly. I don't think any or many of them will be strangers to you. We have, of course, Dr. Victor Fung, who's the chairman of the Fung Global Institute. We have Professor Hao Li, who's the Thoma Professor of Operations, Information and Technology at the Graduate Business School at Stanford, and also director of the Stanford Global Supply Chain Management Forum. Mr. Roland Decourvey, who's the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Nestlé for the Greater China region. And finally, I guess I'd better say not least, Hubert Escate, who is a colleague of mine at the World Trade Organization. He's the Chief Statistician. So it's my job to ensure that there's a reasonable amount of order in this discussion, although we want it to be informal and interactive. We'll start with a conversation amongst the panelists and then move to questions and answers with the audience. I've asked the panelists not to make any single intervention that lasts more than 3 to 5 minutes. That will keep the flow going and that will keep it interactive. And I've also been awarded with a certain arm here if things get out of hand. So let me get the ball rolling. Hey Chang Yong, how are you? Get the ball rolling by asking Victor a question. Ever since I've known him and talked about supply chains, he's always been concerned about how quickly they're changing and in how many different ways they're changing. So I'd like to just kick off the conversation by asking Victor what he has in mind when he talks in those terms.
Okay, sure. If you don't mind, Patrick, I'm going to stand up because the chairs are too comfortable. I'm going to kind of fall asleep there. Morning, everybody, and welcome up here in the supply chain. Is this thing working? On. Hello? Hello? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Morning, everybody. What I'd like to just suggest to all of you is, you know, the supply chains that the world has seen really in the last 20, 30 years is in the process of undergoing a major change. And from the company level, we're seeing this, but I also like to talk about as companies feel this and change the way they operate the supply chains, what the impact would be on a more macro global level. What has become very apparent and brought out really by the Lehman issues in 2008 is that the world's, as companies feel this and change the way they operate the supply chains, what the impact would be on a more macro global level. What has become very apparent and brought out really by the Lehman issues in 2008 is that the world's supply chain is completely changing. The world before Lehman was very much how do we actually source from the developing countries in the world, especially the Chinas. You know, remember Time magazine as late as beginning of the year 2008 had a front cover that says Factory of the World, and everybody talked about the China price. Remember that? No longer. That world is gone. You know, the whole world was actually a very simple world for trade. I can simplify it in a sense, saying you source from the East and you sold in the West. 80% of the consumption was still in the OECD countries. You source from the East, sell in the West, and basically the containers came back empty. And the people in logistics will know there are big problems in the circulation of containers around the world. No longer. What is happening is the dramatic change in consumption patterns that people are beginning to realize that the developing countries, the producing countries, are now also becoming big consumers. I have some numbers for you. I mean, 14 trillion forecasted global consumption in the year 2020. 8 trillion of that, 60%, will come from emerging markets. This is the growth in consumption. So 60% by 2020 will come from the emerging markets. So if you see the fundamental shift is the supply chains are becoming a lot more nuanced. It's no longer kind of unidirectional. You still produce in China, of course. You still export a lot, but you also think a lot about local distribution. And frankly, for us, let's say serving the Asian markets or the developing country markets, the China market, we're thinking a lot more now about sourcing in the Italies of this world. Why? Because made in Italy commands a real premium in the luxury sector inside China. So that's a very fundamental change, and you don't know how, people used to go to China, multinationals go to China because they want to actually invest, basically to produce and re-export back to their countries. They still go, but that's not the driver. And maybe Roland can actually speak to that also. They produce, yes, to re-export, but they produce to distribute and sell in the local market. Now, that is one major change. Another major change is the whole world depended, this flow, this idea of taking a supply chain, breaking it up, and actually having each piece being done efficiently and then putting the whole thing back together again. This process of global supply chains of dispersed manufacturing basically depended very much on a strong multilateral trading system. In my view, that system is under threat today. And I think my friend from WTO could talk volumes about that. I think the rise of the bilaterals, the rise of the regionals, in the one sense, is a good thing, it's a pragmatic thing for a lot of businessmen to say, hey, that's great. But every bilateral we have to recognize, to use an analogy, takes a piece from the multilateral world, the multilateral wall. Now, if you take a few bricks out of the multilateral wall, doesn't matter, the wall is still there. But at some point, the whole wall is going to crumble. And people don't realize, yes, one regional, one bilateral, yes, it may be a great thing, although I have still to be convinced that there's not trade diverting. I still have to be convinced that I still have to convince about the arguments about the efficacy of bilateral FTAs. Okay, I still have to be convinced. I have not seen any definitive study. I'm a multilateralist through and through. And I'm just concerned that if the system is going to be under pressure, we're not going to be able to operate the same way. And then there are other major changes that now stop. From a business standpoint, what you really see now are the markets fragmenting more and more. Instead of one big market, we're breaking up into a larger and larger number of niche markets. And you can understand very easily that if I want to forecast demand in a big market, it's pretty smooth. But if I break them into little bits and I try to forecast demand for each of the smaller markets, it's going to wiggle around. And how do you deal with the forecasting? I can't order goods 9 months ahead of or 6 months or 3 months even. And predict the demand because it's going to wiggle around. And the only way to react to that is to shorten the reorder cycle. I order what the businessman will say close to the market. I gather as much information as I can, okay, before I do the order, and I buy more accurately. And the biggest cost in the supply chains is buying inaccurate. You buy stuff that people don't want and you got to discount or get rid of it. So because of the fragmentation of the markets, and the difficulty in forecasting small markets, it puts a real pressure on fast response manufacturing. And that also means now, how response time is becoming a major issue. And then finally, if you look at the cost of transportation, meaning the cost of energy, etc., and also some of the social costs, of transportation, meaning environmental issues, and when you want to try to minimize the carbon footprints and stuff like that in your supply chains. It means then that you may want to actually be manufacturing a lot closer to the market, what we would say, meaning inside the market or in a very nearby place, so you can replenish quickly, and you minimize the transportation because of the high transportation costs, and you minimize the carbon footprint. So there is a movement back towards doing manufacturing closer to where it's going to be consumed, meaning the OECD countries. And some people say, well, why don't you come all the way back? And that's the big debate in the US. You know, can US actually get the manufacturing all the way back because of the factors I just mentioned? You know, so I will leave it there, but all I can say is this is in a whole state of turmoil. And the thing that we need to realize, you know, supply chains might have started as a way to methodology to improve the operations of the company. But it's very clear now, because of how widely it's practiced, global supply chains do no less than allocate trade flows, do no less than determine the flow of FDI. Because trade and FDI, in my mind, is both sides of the same coin anyway. And very importantly, it really allocates where the work is going to be done. And not only the jobs, but the level of the jobs. And so, in a sense, the supply chains, when you look at it from a macro standpoint and not from a company standpoint, do no less than connect macroeconomic trends with microeconomic considerations. And it's the connecting tissue. And it's what explains, you know, when you go from the micro to the macro, you know, what really is happening. And if this is all happening at the firm level, you will see that there will be a lot of implications for the macro economies. And in a sense, what for the Fung Global Institute, studying supply chains in our mind is really a study of how the real economy in the world will be evolving. And that's the way we kind of look at it. It's not only a firm level issue of how to operate the firm better, methodology for operating a firm, but it's also to look at, in the aggregate, how the real economy in the world is evolving. And from there, we can look at a lot of the major things like jobs, trade flows, investment flows that we want to look at. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Victor. I think it's useful to have a slightly longer introduction of many of the issues that we're going to be covering in the next hour or so. Hao.
Thank you. I'll follow what Victor did and stand up to share with you some of my views. And it's a very humbling experience because oftentimes I was reminded that in the old days when Confucius spoke and his disciples would then expand on what he said, and then the disciple's disciple would continue to expand. So I'm following that. Victor gave you the big viewpoints, and I'm just expanding on what he said. I have 3 points that I want to share with you. I think what Victor said is very true. As the world becomes much more globalized, and as the developing world and the emerging economies become important markets, I think what companies began to realize is that these markets are no longer an afterthought. Because I think in the old days, oftentimes companies would develop products and try to sell the products in the most developed economies. And then when the product enters into a very mature phase, or when the products enter into the even end of life phase, then they started to export them or sell them in the developed world or a developing world or the emerging economies. So like Gillette would oftentimes sell their first generation products in first the North American markets or European markets, and then at the end of life, then they would use the same products and then merchandise and sell them in Pakistan or other markets. But today, I think companies should realize that these markets, the emerging markets that Victor was talking about, are important ones, significant ones, and growing ones. So successful companies need to start on day one when they develop products, when they think about where to sell, where to market the products, that these are important markets, and they're not an afterthought. Crocs, for example, very successful shoe companies, on day one, which is a young company, the company was about maybe 10 years old, on day one, they look at Asia as a market, and they did not say, well, let's first sell in North America, and when the product is successful, then let's go to Europe, let's go to Japan, and then maybe 5, 6 years later, we go to Asia. On day one, they went to Asia. And today, Asia constituted 40% of the total sales of the company. So it's very important to think of these markets on day one. Second, I think as these countries first became the sources in the manufacturing world, now become the markets, they actually have also become the potential sources of innovations. Because I think as these companies have engineering know-how, they have also manufacturing know-how, they could actually contribute to design, to product developments, and many of the idea generation as well. So the most powerful router that Cisco made today, the Viking product, is actually almost half of them were developed and designed by their supplying partners in China. Microsoft's very successful product, Xbox 360, or the first generation of Xbox, is mostly designed by their Chinese partners. So the sources of manufacturing can also become the source of innovation. So we should learn to leverage. The third one is something that I have shared with Victor a long time ago, multiple times, is that I would say like 12 years ago, Professor Marshall Fisher wrote a very influential paper in the Harvard Business Review called What is the Right Supply Chain? So everyone should think about what is the right supply chain for me. But today, I would expand that by saying that what is the right supply chain mix for you? Because as Victor has mentioned, that the world is changing so rapidly. Some places are low-cost sourcing area, and then they rapidly became no longer low-cost sourcing places. And some became innovation centers. Some became markets. Some became flexibility sources. And all of them are changing rapidly. So rather than looking for a single answer to what is the right supply chain, we actually need to become good, what I call supply chain architects. An architect is the one that will say, what is the right mix portfolio of supply chain that I need to have? So I don't look for an answer, the one answer, but in fact, I have to manage a portfolio of supply chain. And so that's what I think is important for the next generation of supply chain executives to become supply chain architects.
Thank you, Hao.
Can I just expand on this last point?
You're the boss.
But I thought Hao made it very important. And sometimes people think of supply chains as something that's very rigid. You know, you do things this way. You know, it's kind of the product goes from here to here in a certain way, and every time you go through, you try to shave off another 1/100 of a cent. That's not true at all. At Li & Fung, every order we basically every order that we receive, we structure a particular supply chain just for that order, and that's why I just want to emphasize the architecture. You actually, the components you move around to fit that order. It's not like a fixed component where you're trying to squeeze more and more efficiency out of. And that's an important point to emphasize. And you actually, you can think of, you know, a mosaic of components in which you use to assemble each customized supply chain. And we customize a supply chain for every order. You order this shirt, we'll do it a certain way. If you order the same shirt a month from now, it could be done differently. Why? Because the conditions have changed. The labor conditions have changed, you know, the availability of raw materials have changed, etc. And you react. It's that sort of, and I want to bring out the richness of that point.
That's
Sorry.
very important.
Sorry.
Yeah, quite right.
Yeah.
Well, you're on the food chain, so to speak. What we've been discussing here, I mean, I wonder what particular relevance it has for your kind of operation.
Thanks, Patrick. Yes, thinking about global supply chain, a few things coming through my mind. First of all, it depends in what category, in what industry you're in. If you are ordering your latest car and it's coming a bit late, you're not very happy, but you can live with it. If you're ordering your latest suit or shirt and it's coming a bit late, you might be not very happy, but you can live with it. If you don't eat, tomorrow, you're getting probably a little bit more emotional, and rightly so. So food supply chain is very different from, I would say, any other industry for a few basic reasons. The first reason is, with the exception of alcohol, any food product quality is getting worse by the day. Okay, of course, wine and alcohol being exceptions, the other product, every single food product becomes worse by the day. And yes, Nestle is very good at preserving food products. This being said, the fresher the better. Therefore, supply chain in the food industry is absolutely vital and is a question of surviving. The second point is there is, and some people know it, but maybe not everybody, there is over the last 10 years a very serious growing gap between supply and demand in the food agriculture sector in the world. And just like to remind you that last night, 1 billion people went to bed hungry. And by the way, the number is higher than it used to be 20 years ago. Now, why is the gap growing between supply and demand in terms of food production? A few key points. First of all, demand. The population is growing, and then back to Asia. Most of the reasons are linked to Asia, mostly China and India, but not only. Population is growing. People are getting more affluent. Something we heard this morning is, what if Asians want to live the life of Westerners? I mean, who are we in Europe to say that, you know, Asians should not eat the same way than we eat? I'm not sure it's a good idea, but that's at least what they want to do. You know, and in terms of calorie means energy. Energy means land, surface, production, etc. So more people, richer people eating more, and a very debatable subject, biofuel. You have to understand that 30% today, 30% of the corn production in the States is being used for biofuel. 30% of the sugar production in Brazil is used for biofuel. All these surfaces, because basically the overall arable cultivatable land worldwide has not grown over the last 20 years. So all these millions of hectares being used to produce biofuel basically is not now producing food anymore for humans, which is, by the way, also another ecological nonsense anyway, more and more recognized, thank God. And then on the supply side, you have urbanizations. It's one of the key issues in China. Cities are growing. Arable land is shrinking. Agriculture is probably one of the field which has been the least invested in over the last few years, to a big regret, and water shortage. You have to understand also, back to biofuel, that 1 liter of biofuel, you need 4,000 liters of water to produce 1 liter of biofuel. So much about eco-friendly way of driving. So this is basically the imbalance of supply and demand, which is having a big impact on the whole industry, and of course on the billions of people on the planet. Then maybe a second subject, and I will sit down. Food safety. You see different priorities between the developing world and the developed world, and it's linked to supply chain when it comes to food. Of course, China is the most famous one. Food safety. I was reading the paper yesterday in China. There is research recently. 70% of Chinese people do not trust what they're eating. Partly rightly so, partly not rightly so, but that's basically the big fear of people. So food safety is key. I'd like to remind you also, and it's not a joke, that in Europe, in Norway, somebody can kill 77 people and be sentenced, the maximum sentence would be 21 years in prison. In China, you fool around with food safety, you do get the death penalty. So this is a little bit of a serious issue, and rightly so. So food safety is key, and therefore, as a company, a food company, you have to look at the whole value chain, and the more upstream you go, the more, of course, secure it becomes. On the US and Europe, it's the same interest to look at upstream as much as possible to guarantee quality, but the reason is a little bit different. It's more about sustainability. It's more about traceability. You want to know which farmer produced these ingredients, and there's a whole social aspect to it. But basically, the trend for and people like Nestlé is you've got to go upstream as much as possible. You've got to control, doesn't mean own, but you've got to control your supply chain as much as possible, work with farmers, make projects with farmers. And in our case, we can talk about it later, be it our key ingredients like milk, coffee, and sugar. We have to go higher and higher, straight to the farmers to guarantee the quality, to guarantee the supply. And again, half-jokingly, we have countries recently who went to war to guarantee the supply of oil with relative success, as we know. While in the industry world, we also have to kind of go to a more peaceful way to guarantee our supply of raw material.
Does anyone want to comment on anything that Roland has said before we ask?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of things, but let me just quickly ask Roland a couple of questions. I find it staggering that 1 billion people would go to bed hungry in today's world. I've always understood, just 3 quick questions. I've always thought that, at least in today's world, hunger is a problem of logistics and distribution as opposed to the amount of food. So if you add up all the food in the world and all the people, actually there's more food than people today. Then in a few years it may be different. It's getting the food to the people that is the issue. Is that true or not? The second is, I find it fascinating that you mentioned that people in developing countries are actually now eating better from a Western standard. Are the people in the developing countries, the people of poverty, the people still going hungry, mainly because within the developing countries there is a less fair distribution of food, if you see what I mean? The better the people are actually taking food away from the poorer people, in a sense, because the better the people with more money are eating better, and they're kind of co-opting the food chain. And I just wonder how much of a problem that is. And then finally, in China, I asked some people who dug into this China food safety issue, which is on everybody's mind. It really goes back to the fact that China doesn't have a cold chain. And because it doesn't have a cold chain, a lot of the downstream producers then put a lot of stuff in the food in order to preserve it without, a proper cold chain. So would some of these problems be capable of solution by actually looking at some of the bottlenecks? Like, I don't know if it's true or not, this idea of China's problem, the food safety problem really originates from the fact that it doesn't have a cold chain and causing a lot of consequential problems downstream.
Would you like to answer some of that?
Okay. Okay. In 3 minutes?
Yeah, right.
2.5.
Maybe to start with China, cold chain, yes. Well, first of all, people need to know, and I'm not here to defend the Chinese government, I've no special agenda, but I would say, and I worked, before that, I was 4 years in charge of Nestlé in Pakistan, and there's without getting into sensitive debate, there's quite a difference between the Chinese and the Pakistani government, at least in terms of implementing guidelines. In China, the Chinese food safety rules, not many people know that, are tougher than the US FDA and in the Europe, especially after the melamine scandal in 2008. So the rules are there. And as often in China, the problem is not the rule, it's basically the implementation.
When did these rules come?
The latest rule was in 2009, because in 2008 there was a major milk scandal where babies died, and basically they put glue into milk to hide the protein content, which led to several people being sentenced to death. My personal opinion, rightly so. Yes. No, was before, but it was long time, but it's a good point. The Congress, the parties, basically the parliament, if you want, in March, which meets once a year in March, the Chinese parliament this year in March has taken away 5 different types of crimes out of the death penalty, and has strengthened, indeed, the death penalty for food safety violation. Yeah. But it was existing before. So there's the rule. The problem is implementation. Cold chain is indeed an issue, but I don't think it's the only main issue. I mean, in the case of milk, for example, the real issue is that, I think, is attraction to quick bucks. And then you have basically a lack of education and people being attracted to, to a quick amount of money in unethical ways. So I think, to me, it goes much further in terms of, education of the farmers, a concept of doing ethical business in China, etc., etc. But coaching is only, I would say, one of the many issues. In our case, for us, we have 31 factories in China, over 50,000 people. One of our biggest factories, we have over 120 quality engineers to check products. Each product is going through 200 different quality checks before it goes out. Because I often say, in terms of quality, don't sound arrogant, but probably no financial institution can afford to buy Nestle. So financially, we're pretty safe. We're so big. The only thing which could bring this company down, and very quickly, would be a major food safety issue, which could literally kill this company.
Sorry.
Yeah. Just to answer maybe quickly on the food, how does the food is the issue of people being hungry in developing world, and especially lady from India probably knows more than that about me, but I was 4 years in Pakistan looking after Nestle, and the big issue we had there is, for example, mangoes. Over 40% of the production didn't even reach the market. So you have roads, you have processing, So we need, what you mentioned in your introduction, we need to move processing plants as much upstream as possible. And this is why, for example, our dairy factories are not in Shanghai, but they are in Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia. There's a reason why, because it happens that the cows don't stand too much warmth and humidity. And it's the same for any kind of food production. So that's I would say, the main issue of access to market. And the developed country, you said, in many countries, again, the issue, it's a bit the same point as the first one. In many countries, the issue is less the availability of food from a production point of view, but what is wasted in the whole supply chain part. But I would say clearly what we can do is really encourage, we're doing it in China, we're encouraging investors to invest into processing of raw material, be it milk, be it grain, etc. But of course, a return on investment, talking about trading, etc. If food investing in farming, we're talking 10, 12% ROIC. We're not talking 30, 40%. So it's all a question of where's the money going in terms of investment.
Hubert, I'd like to have you add something to the conversation. You can stand up if you want.
Okay, thank you.
You don't have to.
I was trying to benefit from the comfort of the armchair, I think. But I was introduced as a statistician, but I will not speak as a statistician here. My first introduction to global supply chain were a long time ago when I worked in El Salvador in 1992 on project trying to create jobs for the ex-warriors. I mean, ex-army or ex-guerrilla, and also the displaced population. And looking at the potential for job creation, at that time there were many firms working on textile, etc., etc. So it was my first introduction to global supply chain. And when I came back to this subject, and thanks to what we've been doing in WTO and that, and what the Fung Institute is doing, I found a very close relationship between what development economists use as a concept to develop value chain on the field, and what we heard about Nestlé and working with Paysant is an example. It's called the cluster approach, which is used by many development economists, especially after the work of Michael Porter, and the logic of you people in the business community working on global value chain. And I guess this is a very important aspect, because it's not usual to have this link between global business and the development economist and the social worker on the field. So I mean, it would be my first point, that we have here a potential. Victor said this morning that it was important not to work in silos. And when you work on cluster, you really work on network. So you try to break the silos, the traditional silos that exist at country level between the people interested in agricultural development, industrial development, etc., etc. So I guess this is very important. But my contribution will be on three risks I came to identify, because my first move when I started working on that was enthusiasm about global value chain and its relationship with cluster. And after I came to realize that there are three misunderstandings that we have to avoid when we refer to global value chain and cluster development. The first misunderstanding, potential misunderstanding, is the difference in upgrading strategy between what development economists think of upgrading in clusters and what business people may think of upgrading in a global value chain. When you work on a cluster as a development economist, you will try to increase the domestic value of your product, getting more peasants, for example, working and linking them with logistics and et cetera, et cetera. When you work on upgrading in a global value chain, and Victor said, I mean, from 1 month to the other one, you may change totally your strategy. Because when you deal with global supply chain management, you optimize your value from an international perspective. So this is the first possible misunderstanding that we would like to, I mean, if I had the time, I would like to work more on that. The second one is the possible conflict between upgrading and job creation. And I would like here to refer to this nice diagram, which is called the smiley diagram or the smile diagram. When you're a firm and you want to increase your value added per unit of output, you have to try to not to be at the bottom on but try to go up ever on the left side of the graphs with more research and development, etc., or on the right side. I mean, more marketing, branding, I mean, more market power. But here, you'll be creating more value added per unit, but less jobs. And when you work on social development and your interest is to fight poverty, you might be more interested in staying at the bottom of the curve and to substitute high value added by high volumes. I say, which is also a business strategy. I mean, it can be very good for a business to specialize in low value added per unit, but to have high volume. I understand that in the business strategy it's called horizontal upgrading. So I mean, you're doing the same. So it's the second possible misunderstanding I wanted to point. And the third one is the relationship between upgrading and global value chain and the transfer of technology. For a development economist, the transfer of technology from so-called developed country to developing country is very important in the sense that you start working with higher technology, you can expect to have higher wage, etc., etc. But it creates, in my opinion, an increasing gap between the small and medium firms in the country which are still working on the traditional way of working and the standards you need to attain in terms of quality, in terms of code of conduct, I mean, and the way you manage your firm in order to be able to join a global value chain. So this increasing gap when you upgrade may in fact reduce the impact of global value chain on the social development in your country. And here, and I will conclude on that, Patrick, don't look at me with your eyes. And I conclude. I was very much interested when you say that today global value chains are no more producing to sell in developed countries, which means perhaps with quality standards, etc., that are far away from the supply condition of poorest countries, but that nowadays you sell where you make the product. So perhaps here there is a possibility of reducing this gap, this technology gap between the possibilities of local producers, farmers, etc., and the demand of the consumer. And with that, Patrick, I stop.
Okay, that's very interesting points you raised. Now, Howard's going to put you right on a couple of points.
Well, I'm excited to hear what Roland has mentioned and also Victor has mentioned, which really is an opportunity, I think. The opportunity is that I think Roland described the potential problems faced by the developing world, which is the people going hungry. In fact, I think 1.3 billion people in the world lives below $1.25 a day, and this is extreme poverty. So there's a huge, huge need besides food. They don't have anything, basically. But yet, I think what Victor says is also true, is that many of these potential problems perhaps can be addressed by people who are very good in supply chain. We are supposed to be experts in supply chain and helping multinationals, helping big corporations to be efficient in the regular supply chain, industrial goods supply chains. But we can actually apply the same of maybe methodologies or maybe perspective to help to bridge that gap that Roland was describing. For example, in Africa, one of the major logistics problems that Victor has mentioned about delivery of food, delivery of healthcare, delivery of anything is impossible because of the lack of the logistics infrastructure. And yet motorcycles was a very powerful means. Motorcycles can go where there are no paved roads, and we can apply these kind of supply chain methodologies in maintenance, in helping them to provide oil filters, spare parts to deliver goods, and that's proven to be successful in Zambia, in Gambia. We can also think about, when we talk about designing products and developing products for those developing countries and not give them the leftovers, which I mentioned earlier, is that in the old stuff, okay, give it to the developing world. No, we design things specially for them, and that's what happens. Successful examples are designing light systems, designing irrigation systems specifically for those countries, and yet it could be profitable. So I do believe that we also have a mission, and we also have perhaps a responsibility, while we are very successful in helping the multinationals be more efficient and effective in their supply chains, apply similar type of perspective and principles and turn around and serve the needed, the people who are living in extreme poverty as well. In that way, I think that broadened the mission values that we can bring to the table.
Victor.
Yeah, literally a 2-minute intervention. I thought Hubert raised some very fundamental points. I think there is a trade-off in value added and jobs by the global supply chains. And if you go to the, let's say the example of the iPad that that was analyzed, everybody's aware of. You know, what that has shown is the U.S. has kept the lion's share of the value added. And then, in a sense, U.S. is now asking for where are the jobs. Now, the same thing actually would apply in the converse from China, because China basically said, you know, for every, I remember Premier Zhu Rongji used to say, we make 50 cents out of every pair of Nike shoes, and Nike makes $95. Yeah. You know, why is that right, you know? But sometimes China itself forgets that it's kept the lion's share of the jobs. So there really is a trade-off. The answer is very much this. Well, it's either you want jobs or you want value added. And then if you have a lot of value added, there is a need for your internal process to create the jobs. And Mike Spence will say you need to then think about creating the jobs in the non-tradable sector. And that is the ultimate. I think that's a tremendous. And then on the technology transfer, actually, I beg to differ a little bit with Hubert. One of the important things that has happened in the world is, do you guys just have noticed we no longer talk about the digital divide? That was the big deal 10 years ago. The cost of technology has shrunk to basically nothing. And I think this thing is going to be changing the world. You know, I just found recently China has 730 million mobile phones, right, cell phones, out of 1.3 billion people. I thought that was pretty good. I just found out recently Africa has 1 billion people and 650 million cell phones. The penetration rate in Africa is higher than China. Now, I think that is going to connect the small SMEs to the world. Without bridging the digital divide, there's no hope. But once you can bridge, I think a small emerging enterprise in a developing world can actually access and participate in the global supply chain. And I'm so glad that we no longer talk about the digital divide. And I think that's a huge development that I don't think we focus enough on. And that is actually going to change also the way the work and supply chains will be developing in the whole world as well. Sorry. No, I took more than 2 minutes.
No, that's quite all right. You know, there are so many questions and issues that we could be going on at this all day, and not just for the amount of somewhat limited time we have. Lots of other questions come to mind that we've barely touched on, and I thought the best thing now would be to open this up and have a discussion with all of you, because you're obviously going to be very active, so let's get going. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Victor. Yeah. Just to introduce myself, I'm Anthony Nightingale. Thanks very much, all four of you, for some brilliant insights there. I'd like, if I may, Patrick, to kind of move the discussion forward in one respect, and that is to address the subject of choke points or barriers, because none of you have really talked about that. You've painted quite an optimistic view in many ways, which is great, of how global supply chains are developing. But I'd like to focus for a moment on how could they develop better, and put a proposition and ask you to comment. It seems to me over the last 20-odd years, actually great progress has been made in the trade of physical goods, both in terms of reducing tariffs, whether by means of the WTO or these regional trade agreements that Victor doesn't like very much. But and also a lot of good work on the facilitation side, customs clearance, single window, etc. But the big gap has been a much less effective way of addressing services. And services are already hugely important. They're more than half the economy of many countries in the world. And they account for an increasing part of actual trade. And of course, inside manufactured goods, as the smiley face shows, there are a lot of embedded services, whether it's R&D at the beginning or logistics halfway through or maybe marketing at the end. So again, the proposition I would like to put is, shouldn't we be getting our trade ministers and our organizations? I know WTO's got bogged down. Personally, I think it's not such a bad thing that there's a lot of regional bodies that are also trying to do free trade deals. But we need them to focus on the services area, not just on manufactured goods. That's the proposition, and I'd like to hear your comments.
Can I just say one thing before I invite the panel to respond? For every product breakdown that's been done, including some by ourselves, the services component, or the invisible assets, you can call them what you will, is 2/3 to 3/4 of the story. So you couldn't be more right. Do you want to get more? Okay.
And then we can all...
Yeah, all right. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Mark Brox. I work with the United Nations. And like Victor Fung, I am very much a multilateralist. Well, I come from a multilateral organization. But at the same time, I work for the Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So I also have a regional focus. And what we have seen is over time that there is a strong emergence, not just global value chains, but also regional value chains. And I think that has to do also with the fact that Asia is not only a producing region, but also a consuming region. Now my question is, we have seen this proliferation of these regional and bilateral trade agreements. We work very much in this area and to analyze it. And we have now the noodle bowl, as we know, with all these overlapping rules of origin and overlapping rules. We talked yesterday about all these ASEAN FTAs that we have, ASEAN as a hub, whereas the individual ASEAN countries are also making all kind of FTAs. Now I'm wondering, both the multilateral trading system and all these FTAs are to a large extent government driven. I have two questions about this. First of all, why isn't business more involved in driving this agenda? Because they are the ones in the end that benefit from it. And secondly, given all the supply chains that are out there, which is really a business-driven process, are these RTAs facilitating global supply chains, or are they in response to global supply chains? Thank you.
Let's go to some more questions. Right at the back there.
Yeah, it's me again, but I'm not going to play the Youth card this time. I'm going to play the urban card. I'd like to have your comments actually on a development which I think we need to take into account, the massive urbanization and the importance of cities. You know, we work for many cities, and if I look at all these charts, they still have nation flags, but isn't, you know, added actually complexity to your model of you cannot just produce in China and sell in the United States, a new dimension, even another dimension, more complexity, that you don't want to sell your product in Kansas City, but you want to sell it in Chengdu. Or, you know, a certain part of northeastern Germany shrinking is actually not interesting for you because it's poorer than parts of Hyderabad in India. So the question of, you know, cities as major points of GDP, not only production but also consummation, adds to this massive complexity of value chain, because countries no longer probably are the real measurements, but, you know, mega cities or very important, you know, booming cities are sometimes important for you, and other cities who are shrinking in the same countries are totally unimportant to you, adding to the complexity. Love to hear your comments on this.
We've got two from the front here, and then one over there, and then we'll take a pause and do something. Yeah.
Hi, this is Chang Yong-ri. I'm a chief economist at Asian Development Bank. I think the issue of the supply chain, global supply chain, was highlighted after the Japan's earthquake and the supply chain disruptions. So I just want to get your view of how whether it's really risky, because after the Japan's earthquake, actually, in fact, we actually didn't see very much disruptions, more than we expected. And that is quite in contrast with the financial, crisis, where the more integration, more linkages among financial institutions cause lots of problem. So do you see any risk side?
One here.
I'm Cliff Tan from the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. I just have, that was actually one of my questions, but the other one I wanted to ask is, what role does intellectual property protection play in terms of an obstacle to expanding supply chains? Because your example about the Cisco Viking server, it occurs to me that it'd be very easy to hire a couple of those guys and bring them over to Huawei, and then where would you go? And I was sorry. I've been thinking a little bit about Taiwan-Chinese partnership lately, and thinking about some very basic R&D that they could do together, and just sort of regular production processes and chemicals and other places. But then I found myself stopped by thinking, well, can they depend on their Chinese partners in terms of intellectual property protection?
Okay, Chin, and then we'll have.
CL Lim, Hong Kong University. When Victor mentioned that the United States was taking the lion's share of value add but crying job losses, people laughed politely. But for democratic countries, I suppose it's quite difficult to point to job losses being justified by earnings per share. I think, my question is Asia different? Is authoritarian Asia different, where we just tell you that it's good for earnings per share?
Okay, we've got a question on services, regionalism, urbanization, internal supply chains as well as international ones. Risk, I should mention that risk is going to feature prominently in the next panel on supply chains. IP, intellectual property, and again the jobs value added relationship. So why don't we go across the panelists and have a shot at these ones, and then we'll be able to come back to the audience.
I'll just pick up one or two of the ones that I perhaps have some knowledge of. I think services is a very, very exciting topic, important topic. And I believe that besides what you already propose, the importance of maybe trade ministers looking at it and paying the same level of attention like the physical supply chain, I think we as industry leaders should also look at services in the same way like looking at the physical products. In the past, the physical products were able to leverage the power of the global supply chain mainly because people have paid attention to how to design products so that they can become highly modular. The picture that I think is shown here is that because the product has become a highly modular in structure so that you can decompose the product and make in India for this piece, made in Pakistan, this piece China, and eventually integrate them back. So we have to do the same thing with services, and we just haven't paid attention to design of services so that the whole service package, if one day we are able to decompose them, then we can have this service done here and there, and then we can integrate them back, and we can have much more parallel processing and leveraging the power of the different pockets of excellence. And I think that's an opportunity, looking at service the same way as looking at a physical product. On the intellectual property, it's always a concern, but yet at the same time, you look at these very successful companies like Cisco and Microsoft and their HP, they're already leveraging those design expertise that are in these emerging economies. And how can they protect that? Of course, I think once in a while there were always some cases that ended up in the court where infringements occurred and there are some IP leakages. Nothing can be protected 100%, but yet companies like Cisco highly protect the integration process, so that even if you have the individual pieces, but if you do not know how to integrate them well together, and you only have stolen one or two pieces, it's very hard for you to still reconstruct the whole product. So it means that I think there's always a concern, but yet you have to weigh the balance between the positive side of leveraging the potential innovative capabilities and the design capabilities of these new economies and the risk of having some IP leakage. So you do it by weighing the pros and cons and the positive and the negatives, and at the same time maybe spend efforts in the integration portion so that you can still have the bulk of the protection being in your hands. So, but it's not a bulletproof thing. There are always some cases of leakages. Yeah.
Victor, would you like to take up any of these questions?
Should I let everybody?
You want to finish off with more time at the end, you mean?
No.
I'm only kidding.
No, I thought I may not have to say anything.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to bring some element of answer or perhaps comments to a few of them. On services, and here I take back my hat of statistician. When we try to disentangle trade in global value chain and really measure where the value is created, here the services are coming big. I mean, it's especially important for developed countries when they export manufacture in theory, I mean, according to traditional statistics, it's a car. But when you look at the value added in the car, you realize that more than 50% are services. And it's where the jobs are, especially in developed economies. I mean, 80% of the jobs are in services. So it's true that we still have issues understanding services because they're immaterial, they're difficult to measure, etc., etc. But one of the big result of our effort of measuring trade in value added is really putting services at the center of the picture, both as facilitators, I mean it's logistic, it's trade facilitation, etc., but also in the content of the value. So my first comment on the role of RTAs. Here perhaps Patrick, who conducted a research 2 years ago on RTA, could be better placed than me to answer. But from what we understand from WTO is that global value chain may be the driving factor behind the signature of RTAs. And it also answers a concern about intellectual property. And one of the reasons we see business people pushing more for bilateral or regional trade agreement rather than the multilateral negotiation is that some of the business community concerns on competitive regulation, IP protection, etc., are better treated or more treated in regional trade agreement. This is why there were some results on that, and perhaps the moderator could say some word on that if...
your boss, you mean?
The cities, I fully agree that cities in terms of demand, but going back to my cluster approach, I mean, a city by definition is a cluster. Because you will find in the same area many people with different talent, etc., etc. So cities are the main agent also in this cluster approach. But I will not really agree on the fact that nations are disappearing and cities are growing, because the cultural dimension remains very important. And one of the reasons global value chain were able to be such a success that in a global value chain, at the difference of the integrated industry of the early 20th century, where you were producing mass thing, indifferentiated, in global value chain, you have the flexibility of adapting your product to the demand of the consumer. And I guess the cultural dimension is still very strong. I mean, we should not downplay the national dimension, at least for cultural reason. And finally, on the disruption of global value chain, the crisis of 2008, 2009 was a big shock. I mean, you referred to Japan, but I mean, if we go back before, I mean, when we had the global crisis, it spread so fast. One of the reasons it spread so fast was through global value chain. Are re-estimating the risk through, and so that there are a lot of work. I mean, don't want to enter into the details, but reassessing the distribution of probability, the people speaking about black swans, fat tails, etc., where they try to rethink the management of risk through global value chain. So I mean, it has an impact, in my opinion, on the way it's managed.
Roland.
Let me then start maybe with this part regarding risk management. In the case of Japan, actually we had a very serious issue because the only manufacturer worldwide of a specific emulsifier, which we use in some product we have, Coffee Mate and other stuff, it was based in the north of Japan, and we basically ran out of product for close to 6 months. And one of the assessment we had is we had to find basically other sources because we're too dependent on one specific supplier. So, and that's frankly, okay, maybe another subject regarding more globalization is the just-in-time concept and the over-dependency on fewer suppliers is definitely increasing the risk. At least that's what I believe. Just regarding the point regarding optimist, maybe I didn't express myself. I'm an optimist, but I'm not optimist about the future of supply of food in this world. I'm not at all. Clearly, water, it's a big subject, but the big issue in producing food in this world is water. Few people realize that this planet will run out of water, fresh water, decades before we run out of oil. And the last time I checked, it's easy to replace oil with something, might be more expensive, more complex, but we have other resources. Water, so far, HO2 has not been easy to replace with anything. So clearly we have a big potential, and often said half-jokingly, JFK said once, whoever will solve the problem of water in this world will deserve 2 Nobel Prizes, one for science and one for peace. Because clearly that's a very big issue which I think we by far not solved. FT involvement of the business, in the case of China less, but in our case, for example, ASEAN, 25 years ago, we were very much involved in pushing for ASEAN, which made a lot of sense for our operations there. Cities, I would, more than talking about cities, I would talk about regions. And it's of course, in the case of the food industry, you adapt your offer to the consumers. And in the case of, you don't sell Nespresso capsules in rural Sichuan. You try to focus more in Hong Kong and Shanghai. And we have products focusing on the rural parts. So we really clearly, in at least the food industry, you do have to adapt your strategy to specific regions and channels. And the last point regarding IP, interesting IP and impact on supply chain. In the case of China, actually you could reverse the argument by saying China is becoming, in some instance, such a violator in IP that it's a major source of income for some people. In our case, we have a team doing only IP regulations. Just to give you an idea, last year we had 1,000 police raids. So every day we had 3 raids. We're talking police raids, huh? Not just sending an email, or police raids per day to shut down copycats. And actually some of our products, be it Maggi, be it other stuff, being exported in mega large quantities in Africa mostly, and a bit in Southeast Asia. So it's clearly an issue, less for us here, but actually more for other countries using China as a base for export.
We actually, so the questions have raised 2 things that are definitely going to be on the research agenda. I just briefly, very briefly mention them. The first is on the relationship between these regional agreements and supply chains, and how much policy interference the regional arrangements end up visiting on the supply chains. It is a very mixed story, and the quality of these agreements varies quite considerably. What we'd like to look at when we get some data on, really, we start looking at specific supply chains, see if there's a relationship between the directions of these supply chains and their constitution and the quality of the trade policy arrangements, which in many cases will be regional. So that's something we'll definitely look at. On value added and jobs, this is actually, I think it's more complex maybe than, because look, I mean, at the end, the neoclassical economist in me would say, what are you talking about? Wages are just. Well, that's a starting point, but not a terribly useful one, because wages don't necessarily adjust. But the fact is, when we look at a supply chain, we've got to remember that we're looking at we're taking a cut. There's the supplier of the supplier of the supplier of the supplier, and you really only get at that if you have an input-output table of the whole world economy. But unfortunately, those input-output tables tend to be very aggregated. But we really don't know the relationship between value added and jobs until we get some much more, we need much better data, much clearer, deeper understanding, which is also something we want to do.
Patrick, may I make just a few quick comments, just following our fellow panel? I'll start with value added and jobs. I think it's basically not just a problem that you externalize all the time and blame the other countries, but a lot of it has to do with an internal. Basically, I don't think the idea of adjusting wages is that realistic in the real world. What you really need is side payments, and some sort of taxing of the tremendous value added in order to create jobs actually in the local economy. And what Mike Spence has really studied a lot is basically the whole idea of creating jobs in the non-tradable sector in the domestic economy. So when you're actually losing jobs, you can't just say, hey, these guys are taking these tradable jobs. It's really the value added which you capture needs parts of it, or great parts of it, needs to be recycled to create jobs in the non-tradable sector. And that's an issue which is a domestic issue. You can't always blame the foreigner for all the issues. And in fact, I think we're facing the same thing in China. We basically say that we want to capture more value added, which is a great thing. And we blame all the factories in the Pearl River Delta for being polluting, blah, blah, blah. But be careful about the amount of jobs that that's creating in China. You don't want to throw 100 million people out of work. You know, the last estimation is that 250 million people inside China doing basically value-added exports. Now, where are you going to employ these people? So my view about this rebalancing in China is just a quick diversion. The speed with which China can rebalance depends on a lot of things, like how fast you develop the consumer market and so on. But I think critically it would depend on how fast you can absorb the job losses from the export sector. That means creation of a domestic services economy. And how fast you can do that determines on how fast you can do the rebalancing. Anyway, I think this is fascinating, this idea of really linking, you know, distribution of income or uneven distribution of income with trade and value added. And that is something that we're going to be really studying very hard in FGI. On value chains being drawn too tight, really. I mean, at the company level, it's obvious that we've over-optimized the supply chain. Over the last 20 years, we've just squeezed every last tenth of a cent out of it. And now we realize any external shock, the whole thing, the whole thing kind of explodes, right? So what you really need to do is a lot of double sourcing and so on, parallel sourcing, in order to reduce the risk and make the whole system a lot more resilient. Not just the Fukushima problem, but the floods in Thailand also pointed out a lot of issue, and it goes on. I think on the business participation in the regional discussions, I think Anthony Nightingale is leading the charge for Hong Kong on the APEC Business Advisory Council. And I think APEC is a very good example of how business could actually interact and interface in a regional discussion. Now, finally, on services, I can't agree with you more. The whole world's shifting there. I think we really need to be really taking the whole services thing head on. But I would go beyond that. I like to remind everybody that investments also needs to be looked at in terms of requiring a global regime. Mm-hmm. It's always trade and investments. To me, the two are inseparable. I'm talking about FDI, of course. I'm not talking about portfolio flows. And it's two sides of the same coin. You keep regulating one or having a system to deal with one and kind of completely ignore the other is nonsensical. I remember in the founding of the GATT, they've always said we need to do trade and investment. They did trade first. They never did the other half. And it's time for us to do the other half. And I think it's important because it's easier now. We tried in the 80s, the MIA and so the OECD tried, and it failed to do a global regime for investments. But that was in a time when the world was very divided between the investors and the investees. Now it's a lot more nuanced. Who is the investor? Who is the investee? And I think there's a much better chance of getting a global regime. And then the final thing I would say is this. What we're talking about here, in my mind, is really a discussion about how the real economy in the world is evolving. How it impacts trade, investment, jobs, etc. Now, there's a whole thing that Andrew and everybody in another room is talking about, this massive financial services market. The key is, in my mind, There he is. You finished talking about the financial services. Let me finish just one sentence, and which is the way I think the financial services is going to impact the real economy is through something called trade finance. And I tell you, the impact will be immediate. We dodged a bullet in 2008. I don't know if you realize. Trade finance was being cut off. And actually the G20 came to the rescue in the London meeting. We keep saying the G20 is a talk shop. In that instance, they actually did the world a great service. The world turned around on a dime in terms of trade finance. And if we get another Lehman problem, I would watch very carefully the feed through to the real economy via the route of trade finance. And that's something the trade finance, the finance area is going to look at, is specifically how do we ring fence the real economy from the financial sector, you know, especially on the continuation of trade finance. Sorry, that's it.
Unfortunately, we have to stop, but there is another session on supply chains in 30 minutes, and so I'm sorry for those of you who didn't manage to get your questions in. You still have another chance. And I would just like to, in traditional manner, thank the panelists very much for their contribution.
Thank you very much.
That was great. Thanks, Howard.
Well done.
Hey, thanks.